Yes. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining today. This is the second webinar in a series of 4 webinars hosted by the LEEBED Consortium, which is part of the EU project Horizon 2020. Today's webinar is about nanomaterial pilot lines, and we'll have 2 presenters today. We'll have Anne Barden from the Danish Technological Institute, and we have Catherine Weber from VS Particles. We will have 2 more webinars. The next one is next Tuesday, also at 2 o'clock Central European time, and that one will be about formulation pilot line. And the week after, again, also on Tuesday at the same time, we'll have the 4th webinar, which is the component pilot lines. Before we get started, I would like to add one thing. If you have any question either during the presentation or in the end, you can go down with the mouse until the end of your screen. A panel will show up, and if you click at the chat box, you can type in your question there, and we will really encourage you to type in your questions so we will be able to answer any question you could have. With that said, I'll hand over the words to Anne Barden, which will start the presentation.
Great, thank you, Nina. Yeah, so my name is Anne, and I work at DTI, and I will start the first part of the presentation. So let's see, didn't work. There we go. So first, I will just give you a short description of what we're going through this webinar. So I will do a very brief introduction to LEEBED, which was already introduced very thoroughly in the webinar 1. So I will just give a short recap of it. Then I will present how we produce nanomaterials here at DTI. And then afterwards, I will give the word to Katrina, who will talk about how they do it at VS Particles. So LEEBED is lightweight embedded electronics testbed, and generally it's about that you can come in with an idea of a solution that you want to have a component or some way, and you go in for a single entry point, and then you will be in the LEEBED doing 3 phases, and then come out with what will seem like a production line already of this component. So it consists of 3 phases. The first phase is the technological and economical modeling phase, and this is here where we see if it's something that's already on the market, or if it's something new, if it's something that should be patented, is there life cycle analysis on it and stuff like that, and if it's something that is worth to produce in larger amounts. Then we go to phase 2, that's the pilot production. And here we have the nanomaterial product lines, we have also the formulation product pilot line, and we have the component pilot line. And then in the 3rd phase, it's more like a knowledge transfer. So we transfer all the knowledge that we have from phase 1 and 2. And then we also can have some business plan services and safety services here. And that's, of course, takes a lot of partners to help getting this to work. And here you can see some of the partners in LEEBED. And if you notice under the nanomaterial pilot lines in phase 2, here we are, DTI and VS Particles that's going to present today. So before I start my presentation on what DTI does, I would like to send out a poll to you. And that's Nina, who should be able to send it out. Here we go. And then you just have to answer this just to give me an idea of what your experience is, both within printed electronics and nanomaterials. So I can see. And I should be able to see the results at some point when you have answered. Yes. So I can see that there's a lot of you that has experience within printed electronics, and also a lot of you that already have experience with nanoparticles. So that's nice. And then for those of you guys who has answered no, I hope that I will explain it in a way that you understand. Otherwise, please ask questions in the chat, and then we will take it up. Good. Let's move on to the presentation. So here at DTI, we work in both material development and production line development, but we also work within formulation development and printed components. And even though I'm going to talk a lot about the nanomaterial and how we produce that, it actually connects to the two other points as well. So even though it's only one point, it's going to link to the two others. But beforehand, then let's talk a little bit about the nanoproduction, because when we want to do a nanomaterial or think about how to produce this nanomaterial you might want, you have some considerations you need to put in. That's also in the phase 1 in the LEEBED. And one of them could be, is there already a similar product on the market? What is the availability? Is there special functionality that you want in your product that is not available right now? Or is it a problem about the cost? Or is it about scalability? Because we all know that there's a lot of really good nanomaterials, but maybe they're very difficult to scale up, or the cost is really expensive. So we would rather look to some kind of alternative than actually using the ones that is the best. And then in the last couple of years, we have been focusing also a lot generally in the world about the environmental impact. So you want to produce something that is not harming the environment or the human health in the end. So that's also something we have to consider in when we go in and choose a nanomaterial for a component, or even just the production line. We have to think about all of these stuff. Here at DTI, we have divided into like 3 topics when we talk about material pilot lines. So the first part is that we want to test all the parameters of a synthesis and see what parameter affects the product in which way. So maybe the particle size has an influence there or there or there, and we need to see it. And usually the way we do it is to make like a design of experiments, and then have a software program looking into all of these parameters and see where are we going, what parameters works for example, best resistivity. When we're done in the lab scale, we have to upscale it, and that goes from grams to kilograms, and sometimes a bit more, depending on the method that we're using. And then the final part is the cleaning method, and that's actually a very important part. Usually when we talk about nanoproduction or nanomaterials, we often forget or doesn't talk about the cleaning method, and it actually has a big influence on the final product. So I think I will use a little bit of time to talk about this also as well, besides just the nanoproduction. So one of the pilot lines we have is the batch reactor line, and we have several, but this is just one of them. This is one of the big ones. It's a simple batch reactor in a way, but we have put it with a lot of sensors. So you can have around 40 to 80 liters of liquid in it, and then it can heat up from 20 degrees to 150 degrees. It is controlled by PLC and a LabVIEW program, and then it has, as I said, a lot of sensors. Among them is a pH and a temperature sensor, which is crucial for some of our synthesis. And then we also have an injection system, so we can add material during the process on a later stage. And this method is really good for producing a lot of material because you can have really high concentrations of material per synthesis in these ones. And what we usually make in these reactors is silver or nano or copper or silver wires. And as you can see in the bottom, the capacity of this reactor right now is 5 to 10 kilos of copper nanoparticles. It's 8 kilos of silver nanoparticles, and then we can produce 1 kilo of silver nanowires in these production as well. And we're quite interested in the copper development due to the fact that if we can replace some of the silver, we can reduce a lot of the process cost, in the sense, as you can see in the bottom, both the precursor and the commodity cost is quite high for silver compared to copper. Another method we have is the supercritical flow reactors. This is a different way of doing synthesis. We have 3 different. We have a manual reactor, which is where we do the first synthesis part, and we adjust it's easier to adjust the tubings and stuff in this. Then we have the semi-automated reactor, and we have the pilot production automated reactor that is more process-minded, production-minded. And they can vary from 0.1 gram per hour to 1 kilo of nanoparticles per hour. The difference here is that, of course, it's in a flow, but it's also work at a much more crucial or harsh environment. So we are up around 350 bars and 490 degrees. And the way it works is that we have a continuous flow. So if you look at the schematic of the reactor, we can have a metal salt, for example, silver nitrate, in one of the pumps, the one with where it's at metal salts. And then in the other pump, that's a support, we can either have another metal salt or we can have a support material. For example, it could be carbon. So we want to produce silver on carbon in this case. They are then pumped into the system and then mixed under room conditions. And then they're met in the second mixing point where the black arrow is. And here we meet a solvent, usually it's water or ethanol, that has been pressurized and endures a lot of temperature, so it moves up to what we're calling the supercritical phase, as you can see in the graph. So if you apply enough pressure and enough temperature, you can go up to the supercritical phase. And what's good about this area is that the solvent then will have the properties of both a gas and a liquid, which means it has high diffusivity and high reactivity. And the smart thing here is that when this supercritical fluid hits the cold stream of reactants, it will form very small particles very rapidly that will then flow through the reactor and be matured through the second heating part, cool down rapidly, and then collected. And one of the advantages here is that by just changing the pressure or the temperature, then we move around in the supercritical phase area in the diagram. So if we can be, maybe we could be just near the edge between the liquid and the supercritical phase. And here we can actually tune the particle size or the particle properties. So for example, if we change the pressure and temperature, we'll get a smaller particle size compared to if we have other pressure and temperature. So it's quite easy to adjust. And since we have such a low volume in the area where we actually make the supercritical hit the cold reactants, we also have very narrow size distributions, which is very good for catalytic systems. And it's also really good to produce particles on a support because it's going to be very well distributed and has a very nice small particle size distribution again. So that's where it's better than the impregnation method, for example. This last point I want to put out about this method is that it's actually quite good to, if something goes wrong in the synthesis and in production wise, if for example for 2 minutes the temperature goes up and it shouldn't be there, and it takes 2 minutes to adjust, then we can actually just discard in the flow the 4 minutes that's wrong and then continue the production, which we can't in the batch reactor. There it's just everything is gone. So there we have some nice things, but here we have less or lower concentration of nanoparticles in the liquid, meaning that we will have more liquid in the end, more nanomaterial in the end to treat afterwards compared to the batch reactor. So if you don't need the very, very narrow size distribution, the batch reactor is sometimes the better choice. Then the final step is kind of like a mixture between the batch and the flow. So if you want to have a very long synthesis time, but you need to have high temperature and you need to have a high pressure, we use the autoclave, where for this case or this example, I have taken our material barium titanate that we made. That one needs to have a very certain crystalline phase to have the best dielectric properties. And to doing that, we need to have 48 hours in this 500 degrees and 345 bars environment. And that's where we then use the autoclave because the flow synthesis is not capable of doing this. And here you can see in the bottom, you can see the XRD pattern and the STEM picture of the results. now. So I talked a little bit about that the cleaning is quite important. And usually when you're doing lab scale, you can do centrifugation, but often when we want to make an ink in the end, when you do centrifugation, they can lump together and agglomerate and be more difficult to disperse sometimes. For example, if you're making silver nanowires, they could entangle themselves and be harder to disperse afterwards. And also when you come up to bigger amounts, it's a little bit more difficult to work with. So other people can use conventional filtration, but here you also have the issue that the particles can stick in the filter, or it can clog the filter basically. So what we use instead is the cross-flow filtration system, where you, as you can see, you have the feed stream going aside the filtration or the filter, and then we add a small pressure to it, so we actually push out the permeate through the filter, and the nanoparticles would just pass through. And in that sense, we can change the liquid it's in, if you want to go from ethanol to water base or the opposite, and we can up concentrate the product that we have, so without drying it in any way, and formulate an ink from that. So right now we have a lab scale version that can, I have put 10 liters, but it can do more. It will just take longer time. So the lab scale is good and functions, but we want to have, of course, if you want to make kilos or tons of material, we need another pilot line. So we are starting to build a pilot line that can do 100 liters. And as you can see, it's just a simple schematics over here, but it's basically using the same cross filtration system and adjusted with the pressures in the end. Yeah, and to all of this, both when we before and during and after we make the nanomaterials, and also when we talk about ink formulation and components, we always need to have some characterization. And within nanomaterial, we characterize usually, in this case, with these methods listed here. So we have we want to know something about the crystalline phases, we want to know the composition, we want to know the morphology, we want to know the size distribution and the purity of the material, because that could have an influence when we do the ink formulation, or when we actually end up and make a component in the end. Here are some exampple. Here are some SEM images of different materials we have been making. And the three big pictures are the ones that we mainly use for printing electronics. So here we have the copper as the first one. And we usually work with 3 different sizes in the range of 100, 200 and more nanometers to 1 micrometer, depending on the application, which I will come back to. And we also produce silver nanoparticles in diameter between 50 to 100 nanometers. And then we also produce silver nanowires with different diameters and length. And in the bottom page, you can see there's different materials that is maybe not always used for printing electronics. So the first one is from the case with the supercritical flow reactor, silver on carbon. And here you can see the nice white dots is the silver on the carbon. And we have the dielectric materials, as the case with the autoclave, we have ferro and titanate. But we also worked a little bit with ferrite materials, magnetic materials. We worked a lot with platinum or platinum group metals on carbon support, mainly for fuel cells applications. And then we work with different metal oxides. And here I just have an example of a gamma alumina we produce with the supercritical flow reactor that could produce around 3 nanometers alumina particles. But I will go into some examples now. So I have taken 2 examples out and how the nano production or development affects actually in both the ink formulation and in the component, and how we need to be aware of it when we produce the material. So the silver nanowires, as you can see here are 2 examples. So one of them has a diameter of 30, the other one has a diameter of 60. And it's a little bit difficult to see in the pictures in that sense, but actually that has a big influence if what diameter they have and what length they have. So the idea about having silver nanowires is to make a transparent component. So you still want to have a good resistivity, but you want to have also some transmittance through the component. So here we have an example of some different synthesis we did. In the graph, it's all these A and W numbers are different synthesis we perform with different morphologies. And what is key here is to see we want to have a low loading of silver nanowires because then it's more transparent. But we also still want a low sheet resistance. So we need to find the optimum here. And if you look at the red curve, it has a higher percolation threshold, while the green one has a lower percolation threshold. So we want to work in a certain area, but that means also that if you want the smaller sizes or longer wires or something like that, you might need to use more of for example, PVP in the production, and that could maybe have an influence on when you do ink and when you do printing. So we always need to be aware of where is the optimum between what are we putting in the synthesis and what is actually coming out. And then on the other side, I actually just put a picture of a printed component of silver wires, just to show you that just because it has 70% of transparency doesn't mean that it's transparent. It just means that the light can come through 70%. The second one I want to talk to you about is the copper particles and how they can be an influence. So in the table you can see 3 different sizes of some copper synthesis. So one quite large, one medium, and one small nanoparticles. And here the effect is that if you have if you don't have a laser or a xenon lamp to cure your material, and you want to cure it because you want a dense layer, then you can actually settle with larger particles because the resistivity is lower if you just heat it up at 100 degrees. However, if at your facilities you have the possibility to use a laser or a xenon lamp, you can actually it will be better to use the smaller nanoparticles because they will give you a lower resistivity. And that's also something we have to think about. So if we send some material to a collaborator that is printing it and has to cure it, we need to know how they will cure it, because that also affects on which particle size they need in the end. So it's all connected in some way. And that's also what I'm trying to show here, that even though, as I also talked about in the beginning, even though it's maybe just saying that we need copper particles, it means so much more. It means, okay, how does it affect the ink formulation if we use a greener alternative of the solvent than standardly used, or if we use more PVP, or if we use some other chemical. That has an influence on ink formulation, which will have an influence on the printing. So even though it's just the material synthesis that we're focusing on here, it's all linked together in some way. And I hope that will put up some discussion at the end. But yeah, so that was my talk from DTI, and I will now give the word to Katarina, that will go further with their method of nanomaterials at VS Particle. And I just need to have Katarina take the control.
Thank you very much, Ane, for your presentation. And as Ane said, it's Katarina's turn. But before I give the word to Katarina, I would like to add, if you have any question, just go down to the panel and put in your question in the chat box, and we will answer them in the end.
Yeah, so welcome to my to the second part of this webinar, in which I will present to you the capabilities of the gas phase nanomaterials pilot line, which we have developed as VS Particle. My name is Katharina Weber, and I will take the opportunity in the first 2 slides to talk a little bit about VS Particle. We are a spin-off company from the Delft University of Technology, based in Delft in the Netherlands. And we provide nanotechnology to various industries like catalysis, the semicon market, or the health market. And we provide automated nanoparticle production systems to accelerate the research of new materials and the development of new applications and products. And with this, I will come to the main part, the gas phase nanomaterials pilot line and what it can do for you. So this pilot line is a nanostructured multi-material printer. It consists of a generator which generates nanoparticles from a large variety of metals. And these nanoparticles are in one go then printed onto your substrate, and they form their nanoporous thin film on the substrate. And it's a local deposition method. And so this pilot line is really a system that combines the production and the printing in one continuous process. And this technique is unique. Why? Because we combine the advantage of additive manufacturing with the purity of thin film deposition. And so the technology allows you to locally deposit the material onto your substrate, and this removes the need for masking or etching, which is required in other thin film deposition methods like sputtering. And on the other side, the deposited thin film is very pure. It's free of solvents, and we don't need a suspension or an adhesive like other additive methods like inkjet need. So the film is very pure, and the fact that we need no solvent also means that we need no process step to remove that solvent. And of course, it saves a lot of time and money to not be required to develop that solvent in the first place. So thus the realized nanostructured material provides a wide range of applications. And how do we do this? So this is a schematic design study of the gas phase pilot line. It consists of two components. On the left, you see the generation part, the so-called VSP-G1, developed by VS Particle, or short VSP. And on the right-hand side, you see the deposition unit. And actually, the left, the generation part, is already a research tool that was developed some years ago and is available and used by research groups all over the world. And the printer unit, there we have currently a prototype, and that's already used, also in collaboration with quite some research groups and several industrial partners. So the generation unit generates nanoparticles based on spark ablation and converts bulk material into nanoparticles. And these nanoparticles are transported in the deposition unit, which is equipped with a print nozzle and a substrate holder where you place your substrates. And yeah, then the nanoparticles are printed via that printhead onto your substrate. The pilot line uses a pure gas phase process with no solvents added. So the generation of nanoparticles and the deposition are integrated in one continuous process, as I have already mentioned. And first I want to focus on the generation part in the next few slides. So within the generator, you see two electrodes are installed, and the generation of the nanoparticles is based on spark ablation. So between these two electrodes that are installed in the reactor, there's a little gap and a gas flowing through. You apply a voltage to these electrodes, and when the energy is discharged by a spark, the spark heats up the electrodes and evaporates material. And this vapor is then transported along with by the gas, is cooled down, and atomic clusters forms that will form primary particles. And these primary particles will agglomerate into larger agglomerates. So the nanoparticles are pure, solvent-free. The primary particle size is very small, sub 20 nanometer. The agglomeration size is larger, of course, it's about 100 nanometer. The entire process works at atmospheric pressure, and the production rate is about milligrams per hour. The actual or the number of the production rate depends on the material. And here you see an overview over the materials that can be used for this process. It works with every material that can be worked into an electrode shape, so that it's solid, and it needs to be conductive. And a lot of materials meet that criteria. What you can also do is you can compositions of materials, so you can either use alloys or sintered electrodes as a source material to produce the nanoparticles of the desired composition. So in real life, it then looks like this. The nanoparticle source material is shaped into or molded into a form of an electrode, which is put into the reactor. So here you see the left electrode, and then there's a counterpart, of course, a right electrode on the right-hand side. And this front part there, that's the part where the spark appears and where the material is ablated and converted into nanoparticles. The generation unit offers several methods to mix material. If you use two electrodes of the same material, let's say A, you of course get nanoparticles of material A. If you use two different electrodes, you can make a composite with a fixed ratio. If you really want to control the ratio, then you can use alloyed or sintered electrodes to get to the desired ratio of material A and B. But you can also use two generators in parallel to mix the materials then in the gas stream with a ratio that you can combine via or that you can determine via the input parameters. You can also put the two generators in series to dress the particles of material A with nanoparticles of material B, like core shell particles. And you can also adjust the gas that you use. For instance, you can use oxygen or small quantities of oxygen in your carrier gas to produce metal oxides. Yeah. And with that, I want to turn to the deposition unit of the gas phase pilot line. So the deposition unit consists of a print nozzle that sits in a vacuum chamber. It also has a large XYZ stage with a substrate holder in which you put your substrates. The deposition unit is the deposition process is based on an inertial impaction. So the nanoaerosol that leaves the generator is transported towards the printhead with a nozzle. Due to the pressure difference between the nozzle and the vacuum chamber, the gas and the nanoparticles are accelerated, and the nanoparticles are then impacted onto the substrate. A rough vacuum of 0.2 millibar is enough to impact the nanoparticles, and the substrate that's placed below the nozzle sits on an XYZ stage, can be moved, and thus the print can be controlled to create patterns of your desire. Depending on the print speed, we can print various layer thicknesses from submolar layers up to multiple micron thick layers. And next, I want to show you a short movie. Here on top, you see the nozzle, below a glass substrate, and we print with, yeah, it moves. We print with gold. So in this movie, you see 4 gold lines that are printed. Or is it 5? I'm not sure. And this video is sped up by a factor of 3. So in reality, it takes 3 times longer. But then you just get a thinner or thicker layer if you vary the print time. So this is what such a line, a gold line, for instance, on the right-hand side looks under electron microscope. You see that the printed structure is very porous. It's very open structure, and the primary particles are really slow. As I mentioned, they are sub 20 nanometers. The morphology is quite independent of the material. On the left-hand side, you see an example of a copper oxide film. Looks quite similar to the gold nanoporous film on the right-hand side. And these porous structure are stable at ambient conditions, at ambient temperature and pressure. On the next slide, I want to show you examples of various layer thicknesses. On the left, you see a submonolayer. You can clearly identify the sparse agglomerates that are scattered over the silicon substrate. And on the right-hand side, it's a thicker layer, a continuous layer. So typically, we can print layers of few micron thicknesses within a reasonable print time. And here I have 3 pictures of different magnifications of the printed lines. So on the right upper corner, you see a gold pattern that is printed on a contact lens. And if you would zoom in on such a gold line and look at it under an electron microscope, you see a nice crisp line that is 100 micron wide here in this example. And if you zoom further in with your electron microscope, you see the porous structure of the gold that provides a large surface area and a large porosity. For substrates, you can use, as shown here, polymers, but also any substrate that is solid in some form, like MEMS, SURS chips, a 6-inch wafer. The only condition is that it needs to fit into the vacuum chamber. So 15 by 15 centimeter is the maximum size that you can put in there. The print process does not require electrostatic deposition, so the substrate does not need to be conductive. It can be a polymer, for instance. It does, however, need to survive a 0.2 millibar vacuum. So that limits a bit how moist your substrate can be. And with this, I want to turn to some examples. So the possibility of the pilot line to deposit locally thin films makes this technique interesting for several markets, like the sensor market, the healthcare market. It's interesting for material screening or for micro applications in microreactors. And I want to show 2 examples in the next slides. And first, I want to show an application example for metal oxide gas sensors. So how does such a sensor work? You see the little schematics on the right bottom corner. So in the presence of an analyte gas, the resistance of the metal oxide changes as the target gas adheres to the surface of the metal oxide. And then there it reacts with the oxygen that was previously attached. And so if you change from your analyte gas to air or oxygen, you can change the resistance from high to low. And so the nanoparticles, or the active layer, is deposited on top of such a chip in an additive way. So the active sensing layer is here shown in red. And in this example, the primary particles of tungsten oxide were amorphous with a size range of 10 to 15 nanometer, so really small. But as they were amorphous, they needed to be heated up, I think, yeah, at 500 degrees Celsius and to become crystalline. And then they also grew to 30 to 50 nanometer. And then the observed sensitivity was 100 when exposed to 1 ppm of nitrogen dioxide at air at 200 degrees Celsius, which is really good, and it provides a considerable margin to go to even lower concentrations and be also able to sense these. And these films show a stable, repeatable pattern. And so this showcases that these printed layers provide excellent sensitivity due to their highly porous nanostructured morphology, and due to the really small particles, the sub-nanometer primary particles, that provide a large active surface area for the gas to adhere on. You can scan the various material to optimize the selectivity, as when you use two generators, rapidly can vary the material ratio. And so run a scan to see what works best for the desired analyte gas. And as well as the material is locally deposited onto your chip, it fits the present manufacturing process as an additive step that does not require any post-processing. So this was the application example for the metal oxide gas sensors. And the second example, I want to highlight the material screening capabilities of the pilot line. And here I want to show you a study done in the group of Dr. Klaas Jans Schouten from the University of Amsterdam and Avantium. And they performed a study on high throughput nickel iron catalysts. And they have developed a board with 8x8 electrode dots that they can rapidly read out. And so to test 8x8, so in total 65 electrodes in one go, so to say. And we have deposited the nickel iron electrode layer on top of this. And for that, we use two generators and one printer, so the prototype of the printer. And one generator was equipped with nickel, the other generator was equipped with iron. And by changing the power of the spark, we could change the ratio of nickel to iron in the 8 rows. And we also varied the deposition time in the 8 columns. So we had a nice array of varying input parameters, and then we send it back, and they could quickly get to their results. So on the right hand side you see the cell potential of these 8x8 matrix. On the x-axis you see the nickel content compared to iron content, and on the y-axis you see the deposition time that varied from 1 second to 5 minutes. And yeah, so it was a really rapid synthesis method for this nickel iron based electro catalysts. It took in total 2 hours, and the results are really nice and are also already published. So I hope with this example and the previous example and my entire presentation, I could give you an idea about the capabilities of the gas phase nanomaterials pilot line. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Katarina, and thank you both to Anne and Katarina for that talk. we have got some questions in, and again, if you have any questions, just type them in and we'll go through them. The first question we got is for you, Karina, and it's come from Alexander, which want to know what is the size limitation of the object onto which you can carry out a print?
For the substrate, as I assume?
Yeah, the object, so I guess it's the substrate.
The substrate needs to fit on a 15 by 15 centimeter XYZ stage. So 15 by 15 centimeter, that's the active print area. There we can print patterns on. And regarding thickness, I think 5 centimeter. We have 5 centimeter room to play.
Yes, we also have another question from Alexander. Do you have a method for making a dielectric layer so printing on metallic substrate are possible?
I couldn't acoustically hear.
Oh, I'm sorry. Do you have a method for making a dielectric layer so printing on metallic substrates are possible?
I don't fully understand the question.
So do you have, can you make dielectric layers so you can print it on metallic substrates? Okay, maybe.
We can print on metallic substrates. Yeah, okay. But and the source material needs to be have a certain conductivity. There's a threshold.
Okay. I will. I have another question from Josh. What is the typical gas flow during the deposition process?
So the entire process takes about a liter per minute, couple liter per minute.
And we have one from Alexander. How do you connect the printed layer, or do you depend on wireless technology? How do you connect?
So the control works via a control panel. So it's indeed wireless.
And one more, do you have you carried out any mechanical tests, like how much strain the print can undergo before cracks appears?
Sorry, I'm also reading the question.
Yeah, don't.
That is a good question. We haven't done a lot of studies on flexible substrates. So most customers we had have rigid substrates, mostly chips, and there we do not have a lot of mechanical strain. Indeed, I would expect that the very porous layer would crack readily. This could be improved by annealing. You anneal and you strengthen the layer.
Yes, we got another question, but this one is for Ane. What is your current nanoparticle production capability, and what are the main obstacles for upscaling?
Yeah, so the current output of the...
Katarina, it was for Ane, sorry.
Yeah, so can you just mention it one more time? So,
what is the current nanoparticle production capability, and what are the main obstacles for upscaling?
Yeah, so it depends on the reactor, of course, but as you saw with the batch reactor, we can do, for example, 10 kilos of copper nanoparticles, while in the flow we can do up to 1 kilo of nanoparticles per hour. It depends a lot on the material that you choose, the precursors you work with. So if you have some precursors that has a tendency to get very viscous or something, maybe there could be a different difficulties making through the flow reactor. But otherwise, the main component of thinking upscaling is mostly about actually all the precursor handling in that sense, and the material afterwards. Because sometimes we want to use, for example, ethanol, then you need to have, if you want to do a large scale, you need to have the ethanol coming from another room in here because you need to use a lot of material. If you use water instead, it's much easier. It's also easier to maybe reuse some of the water for heating and or for the synthesis again if we have some kind of cleaning step. So to upscale, there's just more points because you have more liquid to handle. But it's I would not say it's difficult. It's just you have to be aware of more points.
Yes, and we got another question. It's from Mohammed. He would like to know how complex structure can be at the flow system, at the flow synthesis. Sorry.
Yeah. The most complex structure that we have made was a Syria doped support material, doped with 5 different lanthanides and adding a platinum group metal on top of that in one synthesis. So in that sense, it can be very complex if the precursors allow us to.
Yes, and I got also another question and I'm sorry if I pronounced it incorrectly. How will the slides from the webinar be available? We're recording the webinar and we will publish the webinar, so the slide in that way will be public. We'll put it on YouTube at one point, and I can forward an email to you as soon as it's online. We also have another question. It was more general about the LEEBED program. It is also was possible to already prove it to start the real development from there. And in principle, yes. But we have to look closer at each case. So if, Alexander, you have a specific case, please write to us, and then we can look at it. I can't say for every case, it's a case thing. I hope that answered your question. Else, please just write to me or type in a question, and I hopefully can answer more for all. So far, I hope I went through all the questions. I do not hope I missed any question. I'll give people a few seconds to type in some question, and again, I'll like to make a little commercial about the 2 next webinars. Again, it's every Tuesday here in November. So also next Tuesday at 2 o'clock, we'll have the next webinar, which is about formulation, pilot lines, and the Tuesday after is about component pilot lines. And it's again at 2 o'clock Central European time. And yeah, there's no more questions, so I'll thank you.
Nina, maybe I can ask. So can you maybe elaborate who is going to do the talks in the webinars the next 2 times?
Yes, it's different partners from the LEEBED consortium. So next time it's gonna be we have CPI, we have RISE, and we have IT, and yeah, that's the next webinar which is gonna be held there. And yeah, I hope that was at the 4th webinar. There's a lot of partners in there. I can't remember all of them anymore, so I won't go into details. Yes, and yeah, I guess there's no more questions, so I'll say thank you for your time and hope to see you next week. And thank you to Anna and Catherine. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, thank you.